This is class number 64 in the Golden Doves. It's been quite a long time since we've studied Golden Doves together. It's one of my favorite books. But I was reading one of my father's other books during this period. I still am reading it, but I said, let me try to get back on track with the Golden Doves. We were on page 68, and we were in the middle of the section that deals with semiology and interpretation. So we're going to continue. It's page 28 in the last full paragraph. Opacity is a condition of ontology or ontology. Ontology demands total opacity and absolute autonomy. So we were discussing the idea of uncovering the truth, right? So in the Greek mind and in the metaphysical mind, there's a truth out there to be uncovered, and it's an objective, physical, actual truth, which is real, independent of the mind of the observer. So the truth is out there, irrespective of whether there is or there is not an observer to observe the truth. So the ontological truth is the actual truth itself, independent of the mind of the observer. So we said that in order to have ontology, you have to have opacity. By opacity, something that's opaque, you can't see through it, right? So the idea here is that because the truth exists absolutely, and there is no interaction between the mind of the observer and let's say, call it the object that's being observed, but rather the object is there, it's real, it has substance. So that's the idea of opacity, right? Opacity is a condition of ontology. So we don't believe in opacity. So for example, in quantum mechanics, when you observe something, things aren't really opaque because their existence is affected with an A, I'm sorry. Their existence is affected by the observer, right? But that's fine. So in Greek thinking, you have metaphysics, you don't have quantum mechanics. So ontology demands total opacity and absolute autonomy. By absolute autonomy means the autonomy of the object itself. So the object exists independently. At the instant in which opacity or autonomy are penetrated, the ontological object vanishes. So at the instant in which opacity, so meaning if you are able to penetrate an object, right? If you are able to penetrate a thing, right? Then there is no ontological object anymore, right? Beingness, right? So beingness it's a being is a verb, right? In the English language, in the Greek language, in the Latin language, you have the idea of beingness. So something just is, right? So that something just exists. That's the idea of beingness and presence, which are intrinsic to ontological reality, cannot be permeated. I'm sorry, I will, forgot to shut my phone, I'll shut it now, or lower it. Right, so, getting back to what we were reading, right, the ontological object vanishes. Beingness and presence, which are intrinsic to ontological reality, cannot be permeated. So in the philosophical Greek mind, you can't permeate the beingness of something because something exists, right? And that existence is an absolute existence. And again, it doesn't depend upon an outside observer experiencing it. It's kind of like the famous question that we all are asked when we're young. If a forest falls in the tree, does it make a sound, or is there a sound, right? So the idea being, well, there's nobody there to hear the sound, so there is no sound. So the Greek answer would be absolutely there is a sound, right? There is a certain beingness to that tree, and when the tree falls, there's a certain beingness to the falling of the tree, right? And that beingness is autonomous, right? It doesn't require a observer or a reader. In order to be perceived as such, being must be absolutely dense and impregnable, right? Right? It cannot point to something outside itself, because the minute you say that an object points actually to something else, then the beingness of that object is diminished, because the object is not about the object anymore. The object is about pointing out to something else, right? So, ideally, it must function as a gravitational field at maximum density does. No ray of attention of the perceiving subject could possibly escape, right? So, when there is a perceiving subject, the object completely encompasses the perceiving subject. It's not the perceiving subject. So, when you read a text, for example, your mind processes the letters and creates meaning. That's alphabetic thinking. In metaphysical thinking, it's the opposite. It's the object that you're perceiving that captures you, right? And you have no choice but to perceive it as the object exists and as it presents itself, because the object's existence doesn't depend upon your observing it. Objectivity is the total absorption of the subject by the object. So you see how the subject is completely absorbed by the object, right? So there's only one truth, and that one truth imposes itself hierarchically upon the person perceiving that one truth. To be apprehended as such, a being must be perceived as a totally autonomous entity, and therefore when you look at an object, you perceive it as a completely autonomous entity. Autonomous in the sense of autonomous of you, the observer, because object doesn't need you to exist. It has beingness, it has presence. But one of the most brilliant statements, I think, in the Western world is to be or not to be, that is the question. I really think that's a brilliant question, because William Shakespeare really got to the bottom of Western thinking, which is all about beingness. And if you reject beingness, then all of metaphysics falls apart, right? All right. Right. An ontological object must be context-free, and therefore, another thing about ontological reality. So we said ontology is the actual existence of the object as it is autonomous of everything else. Ontological means the existence of the object onto itself, right? That's how independent the existence of things is in metaphysical thinking. So, in metaphysical thinking, there's no more context. Everything is context-free. Precisely because the object has an independent existence, and it doesn't rely on other things to exist. It has beingness, so context is irrelevant, right? We don't care about context, right? And that's why, like in the Western mind, there's always these triggers, right? There's a trigger, because we don't care about context. So, certain racial minorities are oppressed, so they're automatically right because they're oppressed, right? It doesn't matter the context. It could be that the person complaining about oppression is a football player that makes millions of dollars every single football game. Was Colin Kaepernick? That's a great example of oppression, right? So that's metaphysical thinking. I am, a particular racial minority. I am an oppressed racial minority, and the context doesn't matter. Well, you're an NFL player. I would love to be a player in the NFL making millions of dollars, a game or whatever they make, right? But he's oppressed. I'm an oppressor probably in that type of thinking, because I'm a particular ethnic background, and he's the particular race that is being oppressed, right? So context doesn't matter. Of course there were oppressed people from different ethnic backgrounds. Of course blacks were oppressed in America. Slavery, terrible, terrible things, no question about that. But context, at least in Jewish thinking, matters. But in Greek thinking, Colin Kaepernick is right? He's an oppressed minority. That's all you need to know. His beingness is one of an oppressed person, right? Doesn't matter that he has incredible amounts of money and Nike deals and things that only regular people can only dream about. He's oppressed. Context free. You see the idea of context? Like figures in Euclidean thinking, ontic ontological entities are rigid with points at invariant distances from each other. So for example, this is a rectangle, but I bet if you measure this, it's not really a rectangle. There's probably some oddities, some angles, not exactly perfect 90 degree angles, right? A square would have been a better example. A square is like exactly the same size. So in Euclidean geometry, you have these ideal objects out there in the metaphysical world which are perfect squares and perfect equilateral triangles and perfect cones, right, and so on. So of course that's just theory, and context affects things, because the context of the gravitational field will affect an object, the temperature will affect an object, the air pressure will affect an object, right? So there is no perfect square, there is no perfect triangle. In the real world, things affect objects, things don't just exist, right? And if you put it in a vacuum, a perfect square, let's say you took it to outer space, it's going to be now in the vacuum, it'll explode because there'll be no air pressure, right? So, but again, in Greek thinking, things just exist independently of everything else. Perspective, orientation, and distance are invariable. And in Greek thinking, it doesn't matter what the perspective is. It's always a perfect square. It's always a perfect triangle. No object can be perceived as dependent on another, right? So there's no interaction. So reality is static because things only exist. They have a beingness, and there's no interaction. So reality is completely static. To conceive of an object as dependent upon another is to deny its ontological reality. Once you say that one object, so the sun just exists, it just exists, right? It exists out there, let's say, as a perfect sphere, which it is not, of course, but it doesn't matter. But the sun doesn't just exist. The sun is part of the galaxy, it's part of the Milky Way galaxy, and it's affected by hundreds of millions of stars. And the gravitational force causes the sun to travel through the Milky Way galaxy. So the sun doesn't just exist. There are certain conditions that allow the sun to exist as it does. The distinction between context-bound and context-free types of truth may best be understood in light of the two-process mechanism in the brain by Carl Pribram. Right, so Carl Pribram discusses a two-process mechanism. Let's see what that is, right? And based on this two-process mechanism, my father is going to explain the difference between what's context-bound, Jewish thinking, everything has a context, everything interacts with everything else, context-free, Greek thinking, metaphysical thinking. On the basis of neurological considerations, Pribram distinguished two classes of communicative acts. One is context-free. Its meaning is not predicated upon any context. A rose is a rose is a rose, regardless of whether it appears in a garden, on a dinner table, or in the garbage pail, right? That's context-free, right? So the rose is always a rose. It could be in the garden, growing, and alive, so would say the context-bound person. It could be on the dinner table. It could be in the garbage pail. They say a rose is a rose, it's always beautiful. An oppressed person is always an oppressed minority. A member of an oppressed minority is always a member of an oppressed minority. Doesn't matter whether he's actually oppressed, and some people are actually oppressed. It doesn't matter if he's actually very, very wealthy and successful and incredibly popular and a star. He's oppressed. Another class of communicative acts derive their meaning from their past use and from the current state of the organism using them. Their meaning is predicated upon the specific context in which they appear, right? So the context bound thinking would look at where did it come from? Where is it now? Where is it going to? Within the limits of our purpose, it is important to note that context-free meaning is a function of abstraction. So in order to have context-free meaning, You have to abstract what you're looking at from everything else around it, and only then will I have the real true meaning of the object, by abstracting it. They derive meaning by selective attention to aspects of the image they signify. So in context-free thinking, right, things have a meaning because you look at parts of the image, and what does the image signify? So for example, in the case of oppressed minorities, let's say a person has a black colored skin. So the black colored skin, that's image, right? And that signifies oppression, and that's all you need to know. That person is oppressed. And then among many thinkers now, the woke progressive Marxist loonies, a person who has white colored skin, that's an image, and that means that he is privileged. It doesn't matter whether he's actually privileged. He could have been the most unprivileged person with the worst circumstances in his life and no opportunities in his life, and no ability to play football like Colin Kaepernick, but he's privileged, even though he's actually poor and has a wretched existence. And then Colin Kaepernick is oppressed. Why? Because we only look at a particular image, and what does the image mean, right? They derive meaning by selective attention to aspects of the image they signify. Their concern is the objective real world, and that's why you can't talk with ideologues, because all they see is the objective real world. This person is oppressed. You have no right to even discuss that point. That's objective, that's real. He is an oppressed person, right? Hence, they try to stifle free speech, successfully, I should add. The context-bound meaning is the effect of a subjective operation. Now, in context-bound, there's going to be some subjectivity. More specifically, they derive meaning by establishing a context within which interest and feeling become organized. So in context-bound thinking, there's always going to be a particular structure, a particular reality outside the object that's being observed, right? And there is a certain subjectivity. What do I relate to that object? What parts of the outside world, outside to that object, are related to that object, right? And then I organize my thinking about the object in that way. Interest and feeling. So there's an interest. So maybe I'm going to take it down to the other side. Maybe my interest is now to show how he's not oppressed, right? Or feeling, maybe I don't like the person. So I'm going to now allow that to draw certain parts of the context to reach a certain conclusion and make a certain argument. In contrast to the other class, which is concerned with the spatial concrete world. So in the context-free thinking, we care about space, we care about real beingness, actual world. The context-bound refers to occurrences in the domain of the organism's world within. So the context-bound thinking is looking at time, it's not looking at space. What's happening with that object, right? Where did the object come from? What is it doing? What purpose does it serve, right? So, in context-free thinking, a child is a child, right? The child is holy. It could be. I saw a very disturbing video about children kicking police officers and really like hurling epithets at the police officer in a particular poor neighborhood. Very, very sad to see. These children were raised obviously in a terrible way, and I have nothing but sympathy for them. But just to say a child is a child, no. Perhaps a child can be ruined by the wrong circumstances, right? So now, and then you can have another child who actually is a beautiful neshama, and he was raised in a beautiful way, and he has certain beauty to him. So not all children are beautiful, because children themselves are malleable and subject to the adults who can abuse them and turn them into non-beautiful things, such as those children who just were hurling epithets at police. I mean, talk about kids in diapers. It was really unbelievable to see how low our civilization has have literally descended into the depth of the abyss of hatred and darkness. Right? The context bound serves to express what the organism has registered from its experience, as in the case of the children, who obviously registered hatred of police officers, and its valuation of that experience. Is that a valuable part of that child's upbringing? Well, obviously, yes, right? What he is interested in, what he cares about. So, yeah, so from my perspective, it's very valuable to know that information about that child. And I'll judge the child accordingly. And maybe the answer then is, well, maybe this child needs some help. Maybe we can teach him some good values and some things about love and beauty, and maybe we can teach him that the police officers are there to protect him from bad people, right? So you see, you would deal with one child differently than the other child, because we don't view the child as, just some holy entity, but rather a context-bound organism. The opposition of context-free. I'm sorry, I skipped a sentence. Caring largely consists of being sensitive and responsive to changes occurring in the communicative context. You see, caring, if you really care about someone or something or an object, you would study that object within its context, and then you can help care for that object, right? The opposition of context-free and context-bound types of truth results in two different models for the organization of thought and human experience. An opaque object, a child, he's beautiful, perceived as context-free in the world out there, must be grasped visually. All you see is a child in a static state. He's a child. Opacity. So it says opacity, that you can't look into the context, you can't look behind it, you can't interpret. Opacity not only establishes the ground for ontological reality, but it also determines the means by which such a reality can be apprehended. Right? So because there is opacity, we have ontological reality, right? But it also tells you not just that this object exists and the beingness of the object, but it tells you how to interpret that object. One way and one way only. Opacity is the function of visual thinking and spatial organization. And always people who have this ontological view, they think always in terms of space, right? In terms of visual. Please see the classes I gave in Golden Doves on successive synthesis versus simultaneous synthesis. The context-bound type of truth perceived in the world within is grasped either syntagmatically by relating it to the context at hand, or paradigmatically by relating it to an ideal model. So in context-bound reality, you're going to view this particular object syntagmatically by comparing that object to other objects. So this triangle should be compared to other triangles, or this person who's a member of an oppressed minority, Colin Kaepernick, should be compared to actual oppressed people, right? So that's syntagmatic opposition. Say, well, hold on 1 second. This person was actually a slave or was actually oppressed, right? And this person, well, I guess he's not oppressed, right? If I compare it to that, that's one possibility. Or paradigmatically, there's a paradigm of the oppressed person, right? And you compare this particular Colin Kaepernick, in my example, to the paradigm of an oppressed person, right? That would be paradigmatic opposition. Right. The processing of such data is best modeled in terms of temporal organization and successive synthesis. So in this time, you're interested in a dynamic reality. What's happening? What actually took place? The Greeks and Hebrews developed their respective cultures and way of thinking in terms of each of these models. So now you understand, Greek thinking is not reducible to Hebrew thinking. They're completely different. Hebrews are interested in successive synthesis, temporal axis. Greeks are interested in spatial successive, simultaneous synthesis in the reality as a context-free existence. What are objects? And we'll tell you how to interpret what meaning to attribute to these objects, or to these people, or to these situations.